This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. We've been making cheese in Wisconsin since before we were even a state, which may be one reason why we win so many awards for it. It's what happens when a whole state dreams in cheese. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Eric Asimov. We'll talk to Eric about wine, the past, the future, and more. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. Eric Asimov has been writing for the New York Times for over 3 decades, serving as the chief wine critic since 2004. Although Eric is known for his great wine evaluation and recommendations, his stories go far beyond the glass, discussing culture, history, science, the producers, and more, yet never forgetting the simple pleasure of wine. His column, The Pour, appears weekly online at NewYorkTimes.com and in print every Wednesday. I want to wish everyone a happy new year and welcome you to a new season of the Grape Nation. This is our 9th year, and I want to welcome back to the Grape Nation, and I say back because Eric's been on a bunch of times, Eric Asimov. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, and congratulations on your anniversary.
There you go. So the other thing is, thank you for joining us on our first episode of 2025. We're talking to Eric remotely via our audio app, Zencaster. Are you in New York right now?
I am.
Okay.
I'm in my apartment.
Okay. So Eric's in New York. I'm in New Jersey. So Eric, I think I'd like to make this a tradition and kick off the new year with our first guest every year. Now, you didn't do it last year. You did the same show 2 years ago. So I'm not asking you to commit now. I'm not putting any pressure on it. Just think about it. We don't have
good Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
Okay. All right. So all I really have to worry about is the creek. All right, let's get started. Some of this stuff is basic, but it really, it covers things that I think nobody better than you can discuss, and I'm sure my listeners want to hear. So think about this. Can we take a brief look back at 2024 and tell me about the more interesting or compelling stories that stood out to you during the past year? And literally, Eric, if it's one thing or a couple things or little things, you don't have to go too crazy. But does anything, when you look back and we're still fresh at it, anything come to mind? Things?
Absolutely. I think the number one thing is the mood, doom and gloom. I guess, things came at the wine industry from all directions. Of course, you have the overarching crisis of climate change.
Right.
Then you had the series of health warnings and their targeting of not wine, but alcohol.
Right.
Then you had
Eric, you differentiated wine, not alcohol. So what does that mean? Is it alcoholism?
Yeah.
I mean, why did you say
yes?
that?
I mean, wine is an alcoholic beverage, and all alcoholic beverages have inherent dangers to them, whether it's health or just overindulgence, driving. all of the myriad things that can happen if you're not careful.
Right.
But I think there are significant differences between wine and other alcoholic beverages. And just part of it is custom. Um, Wine is a beverage historically that's consumed with meals. Um, this is not uh, 100% followed nowadays, but I know for me, I rarely drink wine without a meal. And I think that's certainly the case with wine more so than other beverages.
Agree.
And when you're drinking with food, it tends to mitigate the binging aspect of consumption, which is so dangerous. This is not to say that you can't drink beer with a meal. Spirits, I'm not really sure. I know people talk about matching cocktails and foods and even whiskey, but I don't really get that
Right.
personally. Um, but that's not historically the practice, and it is with wine. So I think that how you consume alcoholic beverages has makes a difference in the degree of danger involved. Now, I also want to make it clear that I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, um, I, I'm not really equipped to go head to head with any uh, trained scientist who understands these studies in detail. So, what I'm saying is my understanding, imperfect as it might be. But I think when you're drinking with meals, um, you tend to drink less, and you metabolize the beverage differently. So I think we read a lot about the dangers of alcohol, but we don't really get any of the nuances that might exist from the discussion as it's taken place so far publicly.
Right. I think that's, well said. I mean, I think people see the story and, maybe get concerned, or some people even freak out. But, when you put it that way, there's obviously a big difference between spirits and wine. And you eloquently laid out, habits of consumption, with food, and separately how important food and wine together are. All right, so that's one thing, and there's been talk of that, but that just recently broke. What if any, when you look back, anything else?
Well, yeah, the doom and gloom syndrome is multifaceted. There's also the falling sales issue, which it's if you have roughly 30 years of fairly steady growth in an industry, then you have 2 years where um, you're not growing, and maybe sales are declining. There's probably a tendency to panic, and um, that's a reality of late stage capitalism, I guess. I'm
Partially.
also not an economist, so I don't know how meaningful that panic is. But I know a lot of people in the wine industry are concerned um, that fewer young people are A, drinking, and B, when they do drink, opting for wine. And I'm not entirely sure that I agree with their um, observations about this, but it's certainly something that is hanging over a lot of people in the wine industry.
Yeah.
Um, And then, okay, so we've got three things so far, and then you add in the election and the whatever form tariffs are going to take when they arrive.
All right. So,
And
Eric,
yeah,
stop right there because
yes.
I think to go forward, we're going to cover a lot of what you've discussed and what happened in 24, which in 25 it's so ironic because my leading question, and the tariff thing is a segue to 25. My leading question to you, and it's written in black and white here, it says, Eric, when we look forward to 2025, are things more concerning than positive in wine today? And I think you answered that, right? I mean,
Well,
doom and gloom.
the whole division between years is sort of an artificial human construct. Um, I think the mood and the issues don't change because the calendar does.
Right, right.
So yes, I think this is the overarching mood and prognosis for 2025, unless something happens, is more of the same.
All right. So on the Surgeon General thing, um, he even stated that it's the third highest cause of cancer after smoking and obesity. I mean, that's, he would hope it wouldn't be that high. So the effects on consumption, which you said are down, do you tie downward consumption on any of these reports, or there have been trends going on beyond this, the recent Surgeon General report?
I'm not sure I understand your question there, Sam.
Is consumption's down? Remember you said 30
Yes,
years up,
yes,
3 years down.
yes,
Um,
yes.
the
Oh,
surgeon
okay.
the
So
Surgeon
is
General
that
said,
tied to these reports?
yeah, or is it
You
too
know,
soon?
I certainly think it's too soon to tie anything to the Surgeon
I,
General's
I
report,
agree.
but we've had the report from the World Health Organization for a year, and more than that, there's been a growing concern with health and so-called mindfulness and just taking better care of one's body. And I think uh, uh, Robert Joseph, another wine writer in Europe, had uh, made the observation that young people and their Fitbits or Apple Watches, which
Right,
is always telling them, if they don't have the optimum, um, um, uh, uh, a number of steps or
right.
other elements of health, sleep, and so on. This he suggested that this is driving people away from partying or other areas where they might have consumed alcohol. And other people have made the observation that the rising popularity of weight reducing drugs
Right.
also diminishes the desire along
Right.
with food for alcoholic beverages. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
elements to this that I think go beyond dire health warnings.
Right.
um,
Um, you brought up tariffs. Um, the effects. With the income.
Let me just add one thing.
Go ahead.
There are still millions and millions and millions of people enjoying wine and other alcoholic beverages. So, it's not as if like everybody's gone dry all of a sudden. I think that there are fractional uh, elements here that may be added together makes a big deal for the industry or for businesses that depend on sales of alcoholic beverages.
Right.
Um,
I'm glad you brought that up.
and the last element there is also that many portions of the wine industry grew too fast over those prosperous 30 years. And there's probably people in the industry talk about the necessary course correction, which is not pleasant for anybody who's directly affected by that, but probably needs to take place because there's a little bit of, there was irrational growth.
Right. Um, so we're experience a lot of these intersections, generational change in how they view drinking, health, literally things like Ozempic, that change
Yeah.
the way you think about eating. And to your point, people are still drinking. I mean, it's down, but not crazy, crazy down. It's just concerning that it's down at all. So, hope.
And I will say, my personal observation is that a lot of young people are enjoying wine. They're not buying, $200 Napa Cabernets, but they are going to natural wine bars, certainly in urban centers. And I've seen this all over
So you
the
did a
wine
story
producing
on
world.
this. You did a
Yes,
story not that long ago, and a couple of the things that you stated were, natural wines and a few things, younger people were key consumers, and that, after we just talked about wine being down, that category wasn't really down, right?
yeah, and it might be that other parts of the wine producing world could learn something, from natural wine if they weren't so busy sneering at it.
Right. Well, so talk to me about that because when I started the show, I told you, we're going into the ninth year. I think one of my first guests was like Isabella Gero, and she was bringing raw wine to New York. And that was really
Right.
an exposure of these committed producers, aggregated in one room, a lot of them. And guys like Justin Cherno, God rest his soul, Jorge Riera, these guys were, into that as far back as then. Um, and it wasn't mainstream. I don't care if, we define it as mainstream or not, but do people understand natural wine, for what it is now? I mean, do they understand the farming and the low intervention? And usually it's smaller producers, families. I mean, is the story part of it or just people hear natural?
Um,
What?
I think it is in a vague sort of way. Um, I think that people will associate natural farming, which they don't really understand, but they
Broadly,
think
they
it's
hear something.
yeah, they
Yes.
think it's probably a good thing.
Right.
Um, and a lot of people enjoy natural wine without knowing much about it, and because the words have been um, you know bandied about so often, we'll use words like funky um, to describe these wines, even if there's no funk whatsoever.
Right.
But that's not unusual. As long as I've been writing about wine, people use terms that they hear that have zero bearing on what they say they love. It's just the way a lot of language describing wine gets adopted, not because anybody understands what it's supposed to mean, but because they just hear it often enough to assume that's the language they ought to be using.
Is that because somebody, whoever that somebody is, hasn't done a good job defining it, or there's no reason to have to put these firm definitions together?
Well, I, for one thing, think the most overrated thing about wine writing is trying to describe the flavor of a wine. Um, I firmly believe, and I've been writing this for 20 years to almost no avail, that the best way to describe wine is very generally and sort of categorically, but there's no reason to struggle to, with esoteric
Right.
comparisons to try to describe the nuances of flavor that you find in a wine,
Right.
because everybody experiences wines differently. And what one person's tart black cherry is somebody else's boysenberry,
Right.
or even some rare type of raspberry that only they know about.
Right.
So it doesn't really help. And yet, because this sort of flowery tasting note language has been used for so long, a lot of consumers assume that's how one must talk about wine, and if one doesn't at least try, it betrays ignorance.
Right. Um, so the current state of air quotes natural wine, um, as it is, I mean, is it in a good place now? I mean, I think I'm asking a question I know the answer to because younger people are embracing it and sales aren't as bad. So is that a,
Well, I yes and no.
I want to hear the
You
no.
know,
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, climate change is a major problem for family farms, and most natural wine producers are, small
Right.
family estates. And we've read about how uh, climate change is forcing people to explore new areas to plant grapes, and forcing experiments with different sorts of grapes and new technologies and stuff. Um, None of these solutions are available to most small family farms. Do not have the wherewithal just to pick up and start again someplace else, or to install sophisticated computerized misters and things like that um,
Right.
in their vineyards,
Sure.
and do all these other kinds of things. So yeah, there's a um, definitely a threat for a lot of these people, and they're also um, very vulnerable to changes in the business. And it may not be that younger people not buying Napa Cabernet will not affect them, but if tariffs go through against European wine, that's going to be a disaster for a lot of small natural wine producers.
So the potential effects of tariffs will affect everyone down to the small producers, mostly family.
Well, I think the potential effects are a lot more meaningful for small producers.
Right.
There's, I think, multinational corporations are far better able to withstand these kinds of price fluctuations and changes in the market. They have a lot more resources and a lot more flexibility in where they um, sell their wines, or what they do with their grapes, and things like that. Um,
So sadly, if you look at potential tariffs and ongoing climate change, excuse me, are you are we looking at a shaking out of some of these producers? They're just not going to be able, through the years to exist. I mean, is that the reality?
I think it's a serious threat for small family farms. Whether you
Right.
call them natural wine producers or not,
Yeah,
and
thoughtful
and
producers.
that goes, yeah, regardless of the kind of wine they produce.
Right.
And that's probably true for the U.S. as well.
Right.
As businesses consolidate, um, small family producers are going to have the most difficult, or be put in the most difficult position, either finding distribution for their wines or dealing with climate change.
Right.
Uh,
What will
so
it
yeah,
affect?
I'm concerned about that.
Does it have an effect on retail and restaurants? Not the same
Tariffs.
way. Yeah.
Um, I
Trickle
I
down,
think
does that have
so.
an effect?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have an effect if a lot of beloved producers are no longer available, or if prices go up in a meaningful way. And look at restaurants right now, and the cost of wine and food, it's significantly more expensive than it was pre-pandemic. And I think restaurants are, they're really in a tough situation. I think the financials are really, it's difficult for restaurants to continue to make financial sense with the American business model. And I think that labor is going to be affected for sure, as they're less and less the promise after the pandemic of rethinking the restaurant business, and maybe giving employees health insurance
Right.
and a rational set of days off, that sort of thing. That's beginning to look just like a pipe dream, really.
Yeah, our friend Yannick Benjamin wrote a terrific opinion piece in the Times covering a lot of,
Yeah.
what you said. I mean, firsthand, experiential. I mean, his story alone is incredible. I think that that's a good point. Um, when you talk about tariffs, you're talking about Trump. Another thing comes to mind, immigration. I mean, I think this is, at least in the United States, this is a industry that is much dependent upon the immigrant community. Um, if there's this mass deportation move, wouldn't that have an adverse effect potentially on the wine industry?
Absolutely. As the wine, food, restaurant,
That's
all of these industries depend on immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. And, I didn't even mention that. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, that's going to be a serious
yeah.
issue.
As much as we're
It's
waiting for tariffs, we're waiting to see how immigration is going to be handled. I mean,
yeah. I
and
mean,
everything
there's
you mentioned is, in play for effect. Um, Anything else, that we should just,
isn't that enough?
yeah, I'm
I
fine with
mean,
that. Believe me. I'm
no,
so
I mean,
troubled by that, and it's funny how we open the show, with doom and gloom, and
yeah, I mean, let's
I
talk
don't
about
see
the
you as a
bright
doom and
side a little
gloomy guy,
bit.
but I think for what we're doing, a wine podcast with a wine podcaster and a wine writer, it's hard not to think anything but. All right, so give me a chance to shift to something else, which I think is fun because I want to come back to some issues. I think
Yes.
you and I may have talked about this a little, and um, I'm always interested in process, and I'm interested in your process because I'm very familiar with you from the podcast, and even more familiar from reading your stuff for literally decades. Um, so I wanted to follow up a little. Um, I always wonder how do you go about determining what you're going to write about, and there's a cadence to it. It's every week. How do you go about that? I mean, what
You know what? In the beginning like a year ago, it's been every other week.
Right.
So, after 35 years of writing a weekly column, now I'm writing an every other weekly
Right. I
column.
kind of, you're still there, so I forgot that. But that's still, how do you go about, developing what stories you want to do? What drives that?
Um, well, that's part of basic reporting and covering a beat. Um, as much as I'm a wine lover and a wine critic, I'm also a wine reporter. And so I talk to a lot of people in the industry. I'm always trying to observe as much as I can as a consumer, uh, as a traveler and visitor to wine regions and to wine producers. And when I see a pattern begin to emerge, or issues that are concerning a lot of people, or if I happen to find myself having um, you know some really good wines from, say, a place that doesn't have a reputation for a really good wine, or a place that nobody knows about, that has no reputation for wine at all, or for wine made from different grapes that people dismiss as incapable of making good wine, then I think I have a story.
Right.
Um, so I collect, information, um, and then in there's not so much a uh, set in stone pattern as there's a feeling on my part that okay, I've written uh, an issue oriented story, a profile of somebody, another issue oriented story. Now it's time for just some bottle recommendations.
Right.
I try to uh, have a rhythm that's both not quite predictable, but doesn't leave people wanting.
Right. Um, you know, During the course of the year, you always write a series or reoccurring um, articles on wine recommendations. And let me get specific. I mean, these are reoccurring as far as I can remember. Most memorable wines of the year, so your last one was most memorable wines of 2024. You've done 20 wines under $20, recommending wines and price points that you think, are good. You do these 10 wine columns, 10 wines from California,
Right.
10 dynamic
Yes.
wines from Spain. Um, so, how do you, I guess what you were explaining before, something will compel you to say, you know what, I'm going to talk about 10 wines, dynamic wines from Spain, because in your mind, that was a story. So
Yeah,
how
because
do you come about
in my mind over the last few years, I've had so many great Spanish wines from all parts of the country and so many different styles that it seemed to me, in a lot of ways, Spain is the most dynamic country for wine right now.
agree?
And there are a lot of reasons for that, and this is not meant to demean other countries. It's simply that Spain is at a place in its wine producing history where all of this is coming together now. That process has taken place in other countries earlier, whether Italy or France or um, you know or different regions. It's taken place earlier, and you can see it bubbling up in countries like Portugal right
Yes.
now, and Croatia, and even Germany, in a way, even though Germany has long been an advanced winemaking country, but
There's some
so
serious
many
interest
things are
back in
happening there now that
Austria.
it's going in a completely different direction. Austria, to me, it's really exciting to see this happening, and I try to explain it both by you know uh, giving 10 exhibits of what I'm talking about, but also going into the history and explaining why this is happening and why it's happening now.
I think it's a perfect
I love
platform
the
because, if you get someone excited and you give them history and background, they're always going to be there and go, well, give me some wines, and I think that's kind of the perfect column in that sense. So,
yeah.
you're raving about Spain, and I agree. And there's so many regions and so many wines. How do you get it down to 10? I mean, that can't be easy.
No, it's not. I mean, they're not the 10 best. It's just uh, I these are just 10 representative
Okay.
examples, and there are many more, but I mean there are constraints as to how long my columns are permitted to be. And doesn't have anything to do with newspaper space anymore, but there's so many analytics in in uh, in journalism right now, as in all other kind of internet reading, that in some ways it's like too much information uh, uh, for for my editor's own good, in
Right.
my opinion.
Right. That
um,
changed through the years.
if they say, like, well, nobody reads once they get to 1,400 words, that's it. It's really rare that they'll go beyond that. And as a writer, you say, well, yeah, of course, but that's not my stories.
Right.
But
Right.
apparently it is. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think there's a danger in trying to tailor things to what the audience seems to be doing. I don't really appreciate that as a writer. I'd like to believe, and I'd like to believe the New York Times is making journalistic decisions on what's important, rather than, well, readers want this, so we're going to give
I,
them
I
that.
I
Um,
think there's a change, but I hope that you're right. You're not in the days where people come to you and say, Eric, write about this, write about that. I mean, you're beyond that. I mean, this is
well, certainly in as far as wine goes at the New York Times, I've I've never had those days. Um,
right.
there's it's a little bit like being in an island, and my editors certainly know enough to be great
They don't screw
editors
with
and
you.
to
Yeah.
they don't screw with me. They improve me almost every time, but they're not so immersed in the field that they say, except once in a while they have a really great idea that I'm very happy to hear. But most of the time it's like,
That's
so
fair.
what you got?
That's fair.
And I'm happy with that too.
We're going to have to take a break soon, but before we take a break, I want to ask you a couple things. Very specifically, 20 wines under 20 bucks. Is it getting harder
Yes.
to find wines under 20 bucks, after a lot of the things we talked about and just prices go up anyway? I mean, I know the challenge is fun
Absolutely.
and bringing them, but can you still deliver that without worry?
I can always find 20 wines under 20 bucks
Okay.
worth
Encouraging.
writing about, and I'm doing that right now. When we get off, I will get
Okay.
back to it.
All right. I'll be
But
here to see that.
yeah, but it's definitely changed, and the producers are different, the regions are different, the grapes are all different, and you have to be open to that.
Right. That's a huge point, and that will be expressed through the wines that you select. So you kind of answered this for me, but we'll recheck the list. I mean, these features really are an intersection of quality and value, in a lot of research and, bringing all this. So I was going to say, give us a preview of some of the wines, regions, winemakers, varietals, et cetera. But we talked about Portugal, Spain, a focus back to Germany, Croatia, that whole area. Austria, I think we said that. Any other
Yes.
areas? That you
Well,
should.
it's not even, it's regions within these places.
Right.
Like, when
Chile.
I say Austria, it's not the Kemptal or Wachau or any of these well-known places for Riesling, for example. It's Burgenland and
Right. For Blaufränkisch or something.
Blaufränkisch or
Right.
Zweigelt or
Right.
other grapes that we don't know about. It's I it might be Sangiovese, but not Chianti Classico, but from some other place in
Right.
Italy, or you get a red wine from Piemonte, but
Outside of
but
Barolo.
not Nebbiolo,
Right.
not Nebbiolo.
Right.
So you have to understand that there are so many different sorts of wines that are made in so many different areas, that you have. It's easy for me because I'm like relentlessly curious about wine, and that's my job. But for consumers, sometimes it's hard to make that leap, and it's hard to find a lot of these wines because they're small producers and esoteric. And if you shop in supermarkets, um, they're not the kind of wines that supermarkets are buying.
Right. When you write about a lot of these, you kind of write about that, but are you trying to talk about wines that are somewhat accessible?
I don't really even know how to judge that.
Right.
What's accessible and
Yeah, I mean,
where. I mean,
this,
you can get some. I'm lucky enough to live in New York, which is maybe the greatest
right.
uh, place
We have that benefit.
for wine diversity anywhere. But Chicago is a pretty diverse place, and you might have a very different selection there, and different in Little Rock and Tulsa,
Totally.
and
You're not going to do your
every state is different, every market is different, so it's really hard to do
that's
that
fair.
unless you're writing about mass market wines, which for the most part are pretty bad.
Right. You're not going to write your pieces about what's available. All right, Eric, we have to take a quick break. Um, when we come back, I have a bunch of other things to talk to you about. Plus, I want you to do the wine list. We're talking to Eric Asimov. Eric is the chief wine critic for the New York Times. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. There's a reason when you think of Wisconsin, you think cheese. Cheese is a huge part of Wisconsin's history and future. In Wisconsin, the state of cheese, the tradition of cheese-making excellence began 180 years ago, before Wisconsin was recognized as a state. Immigrants traveled to settle in this lush green hills of Wisconsin, bringing their cheese-making traditions with them. These storied skills, combined with the freshest milk available, created a cheese-making culture that is uniquely Wisconsin. Wisconsin's 1,200 cheesemakers, many of whom are third and fourth generation, continue to pass on old world traditions while adopting modern innovations in cheese-making craftsmanship. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
All right, we're back. We're back with my guest, Eric Asimov. Eric is helping us kick off the new year. He's with us on our first show of 2025. Eric is the chief wine critic at the New York Times. Um, we're talking about a lot of different things, but like many things, wine has gone through many changes. And I think we talked about a handful of specific things. You personally, um, have you gone through changes? What changes have you gone through, as a critic, as a writer, as an observer, even personally? Have your tastes changed? The evolution? The answer is probably yes, 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 yes to all of them. I'm just a little curious about, what that is.
The biggest change I would say is, I used I used to be in my 30s and 40s, and now I'm in my 60s. So
Age?
that's
How
an
does that affect?
enormous change, just on my on how I live and what I do. Going out to restaurants every night, and which used to be, which was my life for many years, uh, is no longer a desire for me.
Right,
I'm a far uh, I would much prefer nowadays cooking, or having dinner and with my friends in their homes.
right,
And occasionally I still love restaurants, and I like to go out, maybe once a week or twice, but no more than that. Somebody, we're in the midst of selecting a new restaurant critic at the New York Times,
right.
and somebody asked me, don't you want to go back to that?
Oh
And
my
I said,
God.
no,
What you just said,
no,
it sounds like no way. Yeah. Is that
no.
so? Part of that is age, habit.
Yeah,
Do you experience like wine fatigue? I mean, did that Surgeon General thing, get you thinking for a
no,
second?
I don't experience wine fatigue. Um, but I also didn't used to think about the amount of wine I consumed. I'm a naturally moderate person, which is why I could be a restaurant critic and a wine critic, and not
Right,
either deal with enormous weight gain or major health issues. But still, as you get older, you don't metabolize
no,
things as well. You don't I used to have a very fast metabolism, and I could eat anybody under the table. I certainly can't do that anymore. um
it's a little sad, right?
so yeah, I mean, I but I'm very happy with who I am now. And I when I was writing, I had different issues when I had less experience. You and I have talked about this before, but I think it's a great problem with wine writing, that it essentially depends on experiences that are expensive
Right,
and difficult to have unless you're accepting press trips and the sort of freebies that are prohibited to me as a
right,
staff member at the New York Times. Um, so there were a lot of experiences I hadn't had when I was starting out, and that I had to either deal with or rely on secondhand information. And I realized what a pitfall that is, or was for me. And I see it with other wine writers who may not have had those sorts of experiences. And I'm very grateful, uh, you know, 25 years in, to have had a lot more experience and feel a lot more confident in what I have personally observed than I was way back then.
right. Um, I'm gonna give you an observation or a scenario, whatever, of you that I think of, and I don't know how articulate or eloquent, but I think I can get the point across. In doing podcasts with you, reading the columns, seeing you at wine events and all that, I get the sense that through the years, and I think you were always keyed in on these guys because there's examples of you writing about it. But I really think that, you've made a shift, or your appreciation of what we said earlier, which are thoughtful winemakers, natural winemakers, smaller winemakers. Um, I think that a lot of the stories and wines, are consumed, with that. Um, I don't know if it's fair to say that that's a shift or a direction, but I see that. I love it, because that's the way I think. And I went through, an evolution doing the podcast of more knowledge of all of that and appreciation of everything. Is that, fair to say, or are you going to get defensive on me?
That could always happen.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's fair to say, although I don't think it's only been, my own personal shift. I first time I wrote about natural wine was in 2003, which was fairly early on,
Yes.
and
I
I
know
and
this
I
story, the
cover
Brooklyn story, right? The guy out in Brooklyn.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I
yes.
remember that.
Um, and I've written about it regularly, um, and I think that it's become more important, and it's the evidence of how it's changed the wine industry as a whole has grown and grown, and so I've written about it more. Um, and it's also it's a bigger subject now than it was back
Yes.
then. I never at the New York Times, I I couldn't have gotten away with writing, focusing only or largely on natural wine because it's not we don't have a dedicated audience. People go to Alice Firing to learn about natural wine. They
Right.
come
Fair,
to the New
fair.
York Times for a lot of other reasons as
Or
well.
they'll go to Frenchette to drink only natural wines, where others
Yeah,
are on
and
focus.
the wine industry is a big area, um, but I don't think my tastes have changed that much. I think that my exposure has widened. I know the very first column I wrote as the Times wine critic was on um, wines made from biodynamic grapes,
What was
and
it, Romani Conti?
no, I mean
No,
there was a big event in New York, the Renaissance event, where all these several dozen biodynamic wine producers from around the world were gathering. Um, and this was really interesting to me, and it was intended to signal uh, an area of interest for the New York Times wine writer that had not really been evident before.
right. Interesting.
But I also went through a time where I wrote about other things as well, and I still do. I still write about Napa Cabernet.
Well,
Um,
that's your
you
audience. You
know,
have to, understand your audience too. Like you said, Alice Firing is sort of a natural wine author and,
yeah,
wine columnist. That's not who you
right.
are. I'm the
But
same with
but
podcast.
but but I feel and I hope I don't sound defensive. I this kinds of stories that I've written about, very, let's say, very established wine regions like Napa Valley
Right.
or Bordeaux, I think have been really meaningful journalistic endeavors and critical endeavors that both it illustrated the problems that people like me were having with these regions
Right.
and these solutions which existed within these regions already that I was trying to identify for readers.
Right. I appreciate that. That's the way to write about everything, but write about it in the way, that you described, which is really bringing up.
And I also have become a defender of once popular genres that go out of fashion because of fashion.
Give me an
So
example.
I will give you three examples.
Okay.
Bordeaux is one. California Chardonnay
Okay.
is two. Champagne from big houses. One of the things I really hate is when people in wine, and I partly I might be talking about sommeliers, but not entirely so, because this is also my experience through interactions with readers when I was doing my wine school columns.
Right.
That people eventually pick up on criticisms, and somebody's criticism of over the top, oaky, buttery popcorn uh, California Chardonnays become all Chardonnays suck.
Right.
Criticism of big house champagne becomes all champagne sucks, or criticism of stodgy Bordeaux chateau and their farming techniques and how they market their wines becomes, well, I don't drink Bordeaux, it's so boring. And so I'm always against these sort of uh, all-encompassing stereotypes. And when
Right.
I hear them, it gives me an idea for a story, because I know personally that, I love Bordeaux. I understand the criticism of it, but here's 10 reasons that you shouldn't completely dismiss Bordeaux, even beyond its great historical importance. Big house champagnes, too, and Chardonnays. I love all these wines, and
Like,
I want to see them appreciated for what they are,
can we
and criticized properly when necessary.
right. I like those three examples. They're really good ones, and the way you approach it. Let's talk about a story or two you recently did. You did a story on champagne, and we discussed champagne as one of the three things. But there's been huge growth and interest in champagne. I don't know, the past decade, a little less, a little longer, and it's beyond that celebratory role. People are pairing it and just drinking more of it.
Yeah.
um we've seen the large houses you know competing with growers and vice versa. We're seeing different styles and blends of varietals. Pinot Meunier. My friend Christophe Baron only makes Pinot Meunier champagnes.
And
Climate
only in magnums.
Right. Climate change has had a huge effect on all of that. Why? I'm going to ask you two questions. Why now is champagne, whether it's grower, whether it's house, which are terrific. Why is it? It's not having a time because it's going to stay. But why? Why is champagne just what it should have been now? Did it take people?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm going to argue a little bit with the premise, because I
Okay.
just saw some figures about champagne style sales were falling last year.
Okay.
Uh, I think what's happening with champagne is um, a little sad, in the sense that it's become so expensive, good champagne, that it's only going to be, it's going in a Burgundy direction right now. And, not to be political, but I think the greatest, one of the great dangers in our world is the growing, a huge and growing disparity of wealth among people.
Yes.
And I've seen how it affects, real estate all over, and how it's affected wine. And, it's going to be one of those things that is certainly affecting champagne. And I think that, what you're saying about the popularity of champagne can be extended to the popularity of sparkling wine. And
Yes.
that's why you see so many people, drinking pet nats or exploring sparkling wines from
Come on.
other regions, which are getting much better because they can't afford champagne anymore. And all the good work that's been done to, you know, uh, to explain that champagne is a great wine and versatile, and you can have it at all kinds of you know opportunities apart from celebration. You see the benefits of that in with other sparkling wines.
Yes. Um, I think the category, you're right about that. And, you made a good point about a little comparison to champagne to Burgundy, where it becomes a little inaccessible, expensive, and, falling to one group. Um, we'll get into it another time, but in the article, you really talked about some interesting stuff about, the changes in non-vintage or multi-vintage, perpetual reserves, the Solaris style, which is really, a lot to do with the quality. But my last question.
I was a little concerned that that would be an overly geeky story, and I was sort of surprised at the reaction I got and how interesting
From
people.
all around, you're saying, not just right people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
All
think it was presented
all
very
kinds of
well.
readers who know very little about wine were sort of
I,
fascinated by that story.
kudos the way it was written. When you read something you're interested in and you don't get it, you go back and read the same thing 3, 4, 5 times. Didn't have to do that with this. It was pretty
Well,
clear, which is
that's
that's a compliment. Here's my
thank
last
you.
question before we jump into the wine list, because I know you got to get going. As long as I've known you and this kind of fire hasn't died down, what's with this obsession with Chianti Classico? I went to check myself, and you just recently wrote about it. Reserve is, it's like this guy
Yes,
gives up.
it's really a fascination and obsession of the last. Oh God, I guess it is going on 8 years now.
Yeah, it
I
was as
mean,
long
I've
as I've been
always
doing a
liked.
podcast. That's why
I've
I
always
think.
liked Chianti Classico. I just, it just became evident to me with all the good examples that I was having was just how good it was and how few people realized it. And so I become kind of a proselytizer for Chianti Classico, and I haven't stopped enjoying it. I love these wines. I think that a lot of what people love about Burgundy, you
Right.
can find in Chianti Classico. A lot of what people love about Barolo, you can find in Chianti Classico. Um,
It's a
and
special wine. Yeah.
it can be super nuanced and beautiful and transparent. Excuse me. Um, and it's still relatively reasonable, although I've seen prices going up in the last couple of years.
Eric, that's it. We used to get good Beaujolais for, cheap. It's expensive now, but
Yeah, it's
it's still that great value. All right, don't stop writing about it. Just wanted to check in on that. All right, Eric, we are now going to do the Grape Nation wine list. This is something
yes.
almost to your denial that you've done in the past. Um, This is something I like to offer my listeners when I have the experts on the show. Let's tap into their, knowledge and taste. So I asked 5 questions. It's been the same 5 questions since day one. And the first question is, what are you drinking now? Now, with you, it could be a little different because what you're drinking can relate to what you're writing about, but you can answer that. But also, are there things separate of, the beat that maybe seasonal change or something you're interested? Tell me some of the things you're drinking now.
Well, as you suggested, I'm in the midst of working on some stories that are requiring me to focus on the wines also, like my 20 under $20 column.
Well, that's
So
all over
I've
the
been
world, though. That's
that's all over the world. So, but
you drink
really, my taste is super eclectic. Um, and I probably have mentioned this to you before, though, but what I really love are right now and have been for maybe a few years, are the unfortified Palominos from Sherry Country in
Yep,
Spain.
you
I
did
just
mention
think
that
these
before.
wines are so brilliant, and I don't drink them a lot, but every time I do, I'm so happy.
They're so interesting.
Yeah, what else? German Chardonnays. Who
Oh
knew?
wow, there's been a
Yeah,
lot of
I mean,
ink
we
on
think it,
German Pinot, but Chardonnay, that's a good one.
right. Yeah.
All right, I'll take those two. We don't have to go crazy. This was the second question. Um, Kind of perfect for you because many years ago you were covering food um, pretty extensively. So the question is pretty simple. Maybe it's the goofiest. Your favorite wine and food pairing, not what you and I think is the best. Champagne oysters. What works for you? And it's obviously something you don't eat every week, month, or whatever. But what's that Eric?
You know something? I have come to realize um, that I'm not so interested in wine and food pairing.
Okay,
Certainly not in the very meticulous, precise way that it's been written about
right.
for so often. I believe that many different wines can go with many different foods, and at the end of the day, if you have good wine and good food, um, you
And
may
good
not have
people.
that, and good people, yes. um, you can fuck something up, but you're
Right.
not going to ruin it, unless, and they're very narrow exception there, and that's for fragile old rare wines that you don't want to step on with some kind of ponderous dish.
Right. Being
um,
conscious.
but like, for example, my wife loves red sauce. All right.
Okay.
So I probably cook a lot of dishes with some sort of red sauce. And what do I love to drink with that? Well, you can guess the answer.
Chianti Classico.
Yes.
Yes.
And of course, when you can have champagne and fried chicken,
Right.
that's a wonderful thing. But take something. I love just a simple roast chicken. Okay,
Right.
um, and so many different dishes or wines go with that. You could drink Chenin Blanc. You could drink Cabernet Franc. You could
Pinot.
drink
Pinot Noir.
Pinot Noir, or Chablis, or white Burgundy, or Champagne, or an Etna Bianco, or
Right.
something, a Pais from Itata Valley. And all of these wines I love. And I love finding like really esoteric natural wines. Like a couple of years ago, I had a wine from Herrera Alvarado, a natural wine producer in the Atata Valley in Chile.
Right.
Yeah. And they use as a filter for their wine like an old cow skin,
Oh boy.
which sounds like really bizarre, but it's the most interesting, beautiful wine that they make. And I haven't been able to find another bottle since I had it for the first time. So it's on my list of like always checking.
Right. Don't forget
um,
you're looking
you
for that.
know, I had a Chardonnay from a producer in California, Matt Taylor,
Matt
that I
Taylor's been making
loved.
great stuff.
Oh my God. And I went to visit him recently in California because I was so intrigued by this bottle. And man, is he making great wines.
Yeah.
And I'll drink those with anything.
Right.
So
It's really
it all depends. Yeah.
the question's more structured and rigid than what the answer should be. I get that.
Yes. I mean, it could be that I'm having, uh, you know, uh, uh, I might be making a salmon dish and decide that I'm in the mood for Bordeaux, and
Red
that's what I'm
wine,
going
yeah.
to drink.
I'm glad you
Not
said
a super old, new, super young tannic Bordeaux, but something that's accessible and I know I've had it with, I've experimented and I really enjoyed it. So
so that ending that question, you did the perfect thing, which is drink what you want with what you want, but just make sure that there's some thought to it. Like the Bordeaux salmon example is great. You're not
yeah.
a 2019.
This doesn't mean that I'm not open to this, the mythical perfect pairing. When I go into a restaurant and a sommelier makes a recommendation, I will take them up on it because they know their wine list and they know the cuisine and they've gone to a lot of trouble to see what works together.
Agreed.
And so I'm interested in that, but I'm not
Listen to a
concerned
sommelier.
about it.
All right,
Yeah.
third question, and I forgot if you're comfortable or not answering this. I ask everyone to recommend their favorite wine restaurants and/or bar, and the context is places with good wine lists, good vibe, knowledgeable staff, that whole thing. And when I ask you this, I'm not asking you to give me a rank list. Here's my first, second, and I'm not even, asking you for a complete list. Are there places that you're willing to mention that just do a good, wine bar, wine and restaurant thing to your liking? Are you comfortable?
Um, well, I don't really like to single out places because there's so many
I
great places in New York. And when you single out, I don't know, if if a Times person singles something out,
That's
it
why I
maybe
preface
is
that. So there's
it
no
gets
there
a little undue weight to it.
yeah,
I
there's
will
there's
say,
no
you
lack
know,
of great places. I'll
I can mention a few. How about that? A few newer places that have opened within
That's
the
great.
year.
So let's put it in the context of, hey, here's some new places.
Yeah, here's some new places, and like I love Penny, the
Yes.
new
Chase
sort of
Sensors
oyster food.
upstairs at Claude.
Yeah, Chase Sensor does a great job, and I think Penny's list is slightly different than Claude's.
Yes.
Its sibling restaurant. But it's equally terrific.
Yep.
There's a new place that just opened, Leon's, an Italian restaurant from
Natalie,
Natalie Johnson
yes.
and Nick Andor. And it's a really interesting list. I actually am just writing an article about shorter wine lists, and it's actually not particularly short, and it's got a lot of different things on it. But the Italian portion of the list is so beautifully chosen,
That's a good one.
and the food was really good. Borgo as
That's
well.
Carlo's place in Manhattan.
Yeah, Lee Campbell's wine
Yes,
list, and she's been doing great
she's
wine lists for
legendary.
years, and here's another one. Um, what else?
You know what? Those are good. Those
Okay,
represent
thank you.
no, those represent what I'm looking for because they're all very thoughtful places when it comes to wine and food, and they're newer places, So you're not, singling out. You're just noting, hey, here's some new good places. Fourth question. The question is favorite all-time wine. When I initially asked this question, I was really interested in what I set out to do. And it was like, Eric, what's the most expensive rare wine you ever tasted? I asked Aldo Sohm that, and he goes, that's the dumbest question. I work at
He's
my
not
store.
wrong.
He goes, who cares? He goes, ask me like the wine that was the most important to me. What was the gateway? What was memorable? Transcendent and all that. So the question really is, what's that wine? And you've had a long life of writing. You and I are about the same age and everything. Many years of tasting wine, you writing about it. Can you think of a few wines that really throughout your life were just important for what they meant to you at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a lot of wine epiphanies. I remember wines that I've had early on, and a lot of these are humble wines, because
Give me
when
a
you're
couple of
drinking
examples.
wine as a student, that's what you can afford, and sometimes you stumble onto it, like the bottle that set me off as a wine lover was a bottle of 1978 Barbera d'Alba from Giacomo Conterno that I bought with no knowledge of what it was, for like $7 in the very first Whole Foods market in the country in Austin, Texas, where I was a
You
graduate
were down there.
student. And the wine was so good and so interesting, so amazing that I thought I have to have this experience for the rest of my life. I need to learn about wine so I can, not stumble into a wine like this, but be able to know what I'm doing.
So that really
And
that really kicked it off. That's a good
that kicked it off.
one. That's a good
And
one.
I remember other bottles. This was during the '80s. I remember the first time I had a Riesling that I remembered, a Glocker Himmelreich Cabinet Riesling from J.J. Pruhm. I thought, oh, so that's what Riesling is like. That's what a Mosel is. And I remember an Haute Côte de Nuit from Gaillon, a very sort of humble regional Burgundy that just like opened my eyes to how beautiful red Burgundy could
Right.
be.
Is Guyon
And
Guyon?
Guyon. I
Right.
don't even know if it exists
Yeah, I'm
anymore.
not sure either.
Um,
All right, so those are
but
pretty diverse, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. There's nothing, they're all very interesting wines, and I understand their meanings. All right, Eric, here's the last question. And understand, I've been asking this question forever. I don't know if there's anybody more perfect to ask this question to. I mean, I'm not sure I plagiarized it. I don't think it's like, oh, Eric did this. This would be good for notes. But the question is, I remember why I did this. I have kids, they're like, in their like very late 20s and 30s, and they can't afford, to buy expensive wine for gifts or to bring to dinner. Other than me, they don't have, the knowledge or intel. So I figured if I threw this question on, it would help them. So the question is, recommend to me the best wine around 15, 20, 22 bucks. I'm looking for a red, I'm looking for a white. And I think in your case, instead of specific producers, maybe categorically, and through the show, we've mentioned stuff like I'm sure Portugal would check that box. I think, great muscadets are, good values and all that. So recommend to me wines, wine regions, categories in that price range. And lucky for me, you're working on a piece that sort of covers this, but you don't
Yeah.
need to be as
Well,
expensive.
well, I'll answer that two ways. First of all, my recommendation for everybody, no matter where they live, is to scout out the best wine shop in your area, and to patronize that shop and rely on human expertise there, because wine shops, like restaurants, want and rely on return customers. And when you ask them for a recommendation, they're going to do their best to make you happy if they're a good shop.
Right.
So, there are different inventories and availability all over this country and all over the world. And so, when people recognize or recommend a specific bottle, it's maybe not so useful, but you can always find good wines when you tell people what you want, what the occasion is, and what your budget is.
You just brought up a good point. You have to express some specifics for them to help you out.
Yeah, and I don't mean, I need something that tastes like, black raspberries or is buttery.
Right.
I mean, like, I'm going to dinner and my friend is roasting a chicken or making a steak or whatever. He's making a lasagna. Do you have something for $20 that would be good? And this is, again, it's not precision pairing. It's just something to enjoy, and you've expressed the context. I've come to believe it's much more important to match a wine to the occasion than it is to match it to a specific dish. So what's the occasion?
But also,
yes. So I would say get a red wine from the Burgenland region of Austria. That's Eastern Austria, where the major grapes are Blaufränkisch or Zweigelt. But I think Blaufränkisch is really capable of greatness, and it's also capable of making a really easygoing, delicious, inexpensive wine for $20.
That's a good one. I love the answer of going to, identifying a local retailer that you should support and defer to them.
Yes.
But to be
that's the single best thing anybody can do to drink better.
And even, Eric, tell me if you agree, and I'm sure you do. If you go to a restaurant, you defer to the Somm too, because their whole thing is about curation and bringing food, wines in, that are interesting and make sense, to that cuisine.
Ordinarily, I would agree, so long as you are, you have a pretty firm idea of how much you want to spend.
Again,
but,
expressive. I like red. I don't want to spend more than 80. I think we're going to order the family style veal parmesan, blah, blah, blah,
Right. I will say that fewer restaurants these days actually have a dedicated wine professional. So you can't always count on, finding somebody who can make those recommendations wisely. You don't want to be in a position where you just have some server winging it.
Yeah, but you know what? You brought it up. When you go to a place like Penny, anybody who's working there knows a little about the wines.
Yes, that is true.
I mean, that's
but these are
to the sense, but they do know.
That's a wine-oriented restaurant, and you can't always count on that.
All right, you were going to recommend some kind of white or a white idea. What were you going to say?
I would say a Verdicchio from the Marche region of Italy. These are really dry, versatile wines with a lot of dishes. Really, my favorite is Verdicchio de Metallica. It's a more mountainous region, so you get a little bit more kind of electric acidity and minerality
Can you
in the
spell
wines. I really enjoy those.
what is it? Demelica? What'd you say?
Well, now you're really going to challenge me, and
Just
I have to.
give me as close as you can get, and I'll Google and correct it. I have
You
no
know
idea.
what it is? It's like the band Metallica,
Okay, it's
except it's
Metallica.
like except you're reversing an
That's
A
all
and
I
an
need.
E in there,
Correction.
so it's like Metallica.
I will figure it out.
But
That's
you have to check the spelling on that.
I will do that. All right. So I neglected to mention that I post on our social media all these answers because we like to make them accessible to people. So we'll post them a few times during the coming week when the show is released. All right, we're gonna leave it there, Eric. I want to do a quick wrap up, and I want to get some info from you, and then we're out of here. So if you have a question, suggestion, wine happening, or event, hit me up at sam@thegrapenation.com. That's sam@thegrapenation.com. Listen to the Grape Nation podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your pods. Please subscribe to the Grape Nation and leave a review if you like the podcast. By subscribing, the podcast will show up automatically. There's Eric in the box waiting for you. Follow us on Instagram at sbenruby, on X at benruby. Two different handles, very similar, but you can always find us with the hashtag The Grape Nation on both. We're on Facebook at The Grape Nation. As I mentioned, we'll post Eric's wine list picks on our social media sites. Eric, at this point, anyone who knows wine pretty much knows who you are. But for those people who don't, where can they find all your writing? And do you like people to follow you on social media? There was a time I thought you were a very prolific Twitterer. So
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Eric Asimov. You can find me under the same handle at Blue Sky.
okay,
And I do have a legacy account on Twitter, but I'm transitioning off.
okay. Is Blue Sky working?
Blue Sky is good. I think I wish there were a few more options just in terms of the apps that you could use and their flexibility, but it'll get there. I hope.
Yeah, that stuff takes that. They're actually doing pretty well as far as growth. But you got to
Yeah.
now the columns you mentioned every other week. Just explain to my listeners, when they come out online and they actually appear in the paper version.
There is no explanation for that. They come out when they come out.
Okay,
That's it was so much more predictable in print when you had a Wednesday food section,
I know.
which still exists. But the stories come out when they're ready and when they're edited and when the photography is done, and there's really not a whole lot of predictability or schedule to them. So, but if you follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky, I will always send out an alert when they are published.
All right, thank you for that clarification with further ambiguity. We appreciate that. All right.
Got to see the gray side of life.
Stop it. All right. I want to thank our guest, Eric Asimov. Eric, I want to thank you for a bunch of different things, for always coming back on. I want to thank you for coming on and being our first guest of the year. I can't think of anyone better. because of your insight and all the hard work you do for that. Thank you to our engineer, Armin, and everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam Ben-Ruby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation. The Grape Nation is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.